The universe had grown silent. Not the kind of silence that comes when stars burn out after their time, but a silence chosen. A silence of abandonment. Entire fleets that once patrolled the edges of known space had vanished. Treaties dissolved. Promises forgotten. When the war began, no one wanted to admit how hopeless it was, how the enemy seemed to devour everything it touched. At first, worlds screamed for help and the stars answered. But one by one, the voices faded, and those who could flee did so, leaving the rest to their fate. They called it survival. Those left behind called it betrayal. Out on the fringe, where the cold light of forgotten suns barely reached, there was a people who still resisted. They weren't warriors. They weren't powerful. They had no great fleets of their own, no armies forged in centuries of conquest. All they had was a will to endure, to cling to life even as everything crumbled around them. They prayed to the galaxy for aid, but no one came. Not the allies they had defended in times past, not the neighbors they had traded with for centuries. The universe turned its back. And yet, something stirred in the dark. A whisper carried from one ruined station to another. A rumor too fragile to believe but too hopeful to ignore. That humanity, the young species from the blue world on the edge of a minor spiral arm, had not abandoned them. That humans, fragile by galactic standards, reckless and stubborn, had chosen to stay and fight. At first the idea was laughable. What could one species do against an enemy that had silenced entire empires? What chance did they stand when others with far greater strength had already fled? But the rumor spread, and hope clung to it like vines wrapping around stone. Because if it was true, if even one corner of the galaxy still dared to resist, then maybe the darkness could be held back a little longer. The humans hadn't been asked to come. They hadn't been bound by old treaties or ancient debts. By all logic they should have walked away like the rest. But something in them, something no other species quite understood, would not let them leave. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was stubbornness. Maybe it was simply that deep, unyielding need to stand when everything else fell. Whatever the reason, their answer was clear. They would not turn away. It began quietly. A single ship answering a distress call that everyone else ignored. A crew who refused to run even when outnumbered and outgunned. They should have been destroyed, erased like the others. But they fought. They fought with a desperation and fury that stunned those who watched. When their ship was torn apart, they fought from escape pods. When their weapons failed, they turned wreckage into blades. The enemy took the system in the end, but it was not a clean victory. For the first time they bled. Word spread quickly. Humanity had chosen defiance. They did not have the strongest weapons or the largest fleets, but they carried something the galaxy had not seen in a long time. Unyielding defiance, even in the face of certain death. To many it seemed foolish. To others it was madness. But to those who had been abandoned, those who had been left to die in silence, it was salvation. The abandoned began to whisper, "If the humans are willing to fight, maybe we can too." But no one knew what drove them. Humanity's past was filled with wars, with scars they carried even into the stars. They knew loss, they knew pain, but they also knew how to rise again and again no matter how hard they were struck down. Where others saw the enemy as an unstoppable tide, humanity saw something else. A challenge that must be met, a battle that could not be ignored. And so they stood, at first alone but never quietly. Every time a world fell, they carved the memory into themselves. Every time they lost, they turned loss into fuel for the fire. Where empires had chosen silence, humanity chose noise, defiance so loud the universe would have no choice but to hear it. The first real clash came at a forgotten colony, a place the galaxy had written off as doomed. The enemy descended in waves, confident in the silence they had already created. But when they arrived, they found humanity waiting. Not with polished fleets or perfect strategies, but with grit, with fire, with hearts that refused to break. The colony should have been ashes in a single night. Instead, it became a battlefield that echoed across the stars. For the first time, the enemy was held back. Not defeated, not broken, but stopped. The survivors who watched swore they saw something impossible in that moment. They swore they saw the humans smile through the smoke and fire, as if this was what they had been made for. To face the impossible. To stand when no one else would. But victory came with cost. Humanity bled heavily. Ships were shattered, crews lost, families broken. The enemy was not gone, they would return in greater numbers, stronger, hungrier. Everyone knew it. Even the humans knew it. Yet they didn't retreat. They didn't call it hopeless. They looked to the stars where others had turned away, and they whispered the same promise over and over, "We will not back down." Those who had been abandoned began to gather behind them. Some out of gratitude, others out of sheer desperation. For the first time since the war began, the silence of the galaxy was broken. The stars whispered with a new kind of noise, hope. Fragile, trembling, dangerous hope. And somewhere deep in the black the enemy noticed. They turned their gaze toward humanity. Toward the small, stubborn species that dared to do what entire empires had refused. The war was no longer just a matter of conquest. It was personal. The question was no longer whether humanity would fight. Everyone knew they would. The real question was how long they could last before the darkness swallowed them too. But humanity had already made their choice. Even as their fleets limped home, even as their dead were mourned, their answer was carved into every survivor's heart. They would stand. They would fight. And they would make the universe remember the sound of defiance. The abandoned watched, waiting to see what would come next. The enemy gathered, preparing for their next strike. Humanity stood in between, a single voice shouting into the silence. And in that silence, the galaxy held its breath. Because everyone knew, the next move would change everything. The colony burned for weeks after the first clash. Smoke lingered above its fractured cities, twisting into the sky like the ghosts of those who had fallen. The ruins were quiet now, except for the faint hum of human engines and the stubborn voices of survivors who refused to be silent. The air smelled of ash and melted metal, a reminder that every breath they took had been bought with blood. For the people who had been abandoned, this place should have been their grave. And yet, when they looked out across the rubble, they saw something unexpected. They saw humans standing beside them. Not leaving when the fight was over, not retreating to safer ground, but staying, helping carry the wounded, repairing what little could still be saved, holding the line against an enemy that would surely return. To the survivors, it made no sense. Humanity wasn't bound by oath or obligation. Their world was not a strategic prize. If anything, staying was a burden, a drain on resources the humans desperately needed for themselves. And yet they remained. Some said it was pity. Others thought it was pride. But those who worked closest with the humans began to see something else in their eyes, something deeper. It wasn't pity, it was conviction. It was the raw, unshakable belief that no one deserved to be left behind, no matter how hopeless the odds. In the quiet nights after the battle, stories spread among the survivors about what the humans had done before arriving here. About how their species had clawed its way up from a fragile cradle world scarred by war and famine. About how they had learned to rise after every fall, no matter how devastating. They had no ancient empire to boast of, no fleets of legendary warships polished by centuries of conquest. They had only themselves, their stubborn hearts, their restless drive, their refusal to surrender. And yet, here they stood, facing the same enemy that had silenced entire civilizations. The survivors tried to understand it. Why would a species with so little power challenge something so vast? Why fight for others when even their own survival was not guaranteed? But every time they asked, the humans gave the same quiet answer, because someone has to. That answer carried more weight than the survivors wanted to admit. It dug into them, refusing to leave, and for the first time in years, they began to feel something almost forgotten: hope. But hope was dangerous. Hope could be crushed. Hope could be used as bait. And somewhere in the shadows between stars, the enemy prepared to do just that. Reports trickled in from the edges of known space. Entire stations going dark. Worlds stripped bare in silence. Those who tried to escape were never seen again. The enemy moved like a tide, unpredictable and relentless. And now that tide had turned its attention toward humanity. The first hints came not from grand battles but from small disappearances. Supply ships that never returned. Patrols that vanished without sending a single signal. The humans, stubborn as ever, refused to believe it was coincidence. They began mapping the pattern, tracing the invisible net that was slowly tightening around them. It became clear that the enemy was studying them. Watching. Waiting. Testing. The humans responded the only way they knew how. They adapted. They hardened their defenses. They turned every outpost into a fortress, every ship into a weapon, every survivor into a fighter. Where other species had seen despair, the humans saw a challenge, and they rose to meet it with a determination that unsettled even their allies. Still, whispers spread among the abandoned peoples. Could humanity truly hold the line? Could they really stand against something that had crushed civilizations older and greater than them? For every act of bravery there was a shadow of fear. For every victory, there was the reminder that the enemy had not yet shown its full strength. The survivors who had fought beside the humans began to notice something else. Humanity was not unbroken. Behind the defiance, behind the fire, there was grief. They buried their dead quietly without ceremony, but the loss cut deep. They carried it with them not as weakness but as fuel. Their pain became part of their strength, a weight they refused to let go. That weight bound them together, and it bound them to those they protected. It was not just about survival anymore. It was about meaning. About making sure every sacrifice mattered. But the enemy was clever. They knew fear was more powerful than any weapon. And so they began their next move, not with another overwhelming assault but with silence. The kind of silence that crushed hope. Communications were cut. Trade routes were severed. Entire systems were isolated, left to wonder if anyone still lived beyond their stars. The humans fought against that silence with everything they had. They sent ships into dangerous voids to carry messages, risking ambush at every turn. They lit beacons on the edges of ruined space, reminders that someone was still there, still standing. They refused to let the galaxy forget. And yet, even as they fought to keep hope alive, unease grew. There was something about the enemy that no one could quite explain. No one knew where they had come from, what they wanted, or why they left nothing but destruction in their wake. Some said they were a force of nature, unstoppable and unthinking. Others believed they were hunters, stripping the galaxy for reasons no one understood. The humans wanted answers. They needed to know what they were fighting and whether it could be stopped. And so they began to dig. They searched through ruins abandoned by fleeing empires. They decoded fragments of lost transmissions. Piece by piece they began to uncover a truth that chilled them. The enemy was not mindless. They chose their targets. They studied their prey. They adapted to every defense thrown at them. They were not a storm. They were a predator. And predators only stopped when something stronger forced them to. That realization changed everything. Humanity knew then that this war would not end with retreat. It would not end with negotiation. It would end only when one side was broken completely. And in the silence of abandoned worlds, humanity swore it would not be them. But swearing and surviving were not the same. Their fleets were small compared to what the enemy could unleash. Their worlds were scattered and vulnerable. Every victory felt fragile. Every defeat threatened to shatter what little strength they had left. The galaxy still doubted them, still watched from the shadows, waiting to see if they would fall like all the others. The survivors who had joined humanity carried their own doubts. They had seen what the enemy could do. They had lost families, homes, entire histories. To believe in humanity meant risking that pain again, risking the collapse of hope they could barely hold on to. And yet, when they looked at the humans, they saw something they couldn't turn away from. A refusal to quit. A refusal to give up. It was a fire they had thought impossible. Still, the question remained, how long could that fire burn before it was smothered? The enemy's movements grew bolder. Shadows stretched across the stars, swallowing system after system. Scouts reported vast fleets forming in the dark, too many to count, too fast to intercept. The humans tightened their lines, braced their defenses, prepared for the inevitable storm. But deep down they knew it wasn't enough. Not yet. The survivors whispered it to themselves in the quiet hours. The humans could not hold forever. They could inspire. They could fight. They could even win battles. But against the full force of the enemy? Against the endless tide? And yet the humans did not flinch. They knew the storm was coming. They knew the galaxy still doubted them. They knew the cost would be unbearable. But they also knew something no one else seemed to understand. That sometimes standing your ground, even when you know you might fall, is the only way to change the course of history. The colony's fires had barely gone out before the humans were already preparing for the next fight. Their ships limped into orbit, patched together with scavenged parts. Their crews carried wounds that would never fully heal. But their eyes held the same fire as before, the same promise. The universe had turned away. Humanity refused to back down. And as the enemy gathered in the shadows, ready to strike harder than ever, the galaxy watched in silence. Because everyone knew the next battle would decide more than just survival. It would decide whether hope itself could live. The silence before the storm felt heavier than the battle itself. Out beyond the edge of the colony's scarred orbit, humanity's ships drifted like shadows against the stars. Their hulls were patched with scavenged armor, their engines scarred from endless skirmishes, but still they waited. Every pilot, every soldier, every survivor could feel it. The enemy was coming. The sky seemed to hold its breath. Long-range sensors whispered of movement in the dark, of fleets too vast to count. Broken transmissions flickered in and out, reports of systems swallowed whole, voices cut off mid-scream. The humans listened, their jaws tight, their hands clenched, and they prepared. It wasn't just about holding a line anymore. This was about survival itself. If they broke here, the fire would go out. Hope would die, and the galaxy would return to silence. But if they could stand, just long enough, just hard enough, they might prove to everyone watching that resistance was still possible. The survivors who had joined them felt the tension deep in their bones. They had seen what the enemy could do. They had watched entire worlds fall, entire histories vanish in hours. And yet, when they looked at the humans, they saw something strange. The fear was there, yes, but so was something else. A steady defiance that refused to bend, even as the shadow grew closer. Every night before the coming battle, the humans walked among the ruins of the colony they had saved. They worked side by side with those who had once been strangers, repairing shelters, delivering water, carrying the wounded. They didn't act like conquerors or saviors. They acted like family, like this place. These people mattered as much as their own. That bond was more powerful than any speech. It was proof that their fight was not for glory or conquest. It was for something deeper. But the enemy was not blind. They had seen this fire in humanity, and they had decided it must be extinguished. Their fleets gathered in silence, stretching across the black like a wall of knives. When the first scout ship caught sight of them, the image was enough to chill every soul who saw it. Hundreds of vessels, sleek and silent, blotting out the stars. A tide of shadows moving with purpose, each one larger than anything humanity could field. Still, the humans did not retreat. They tightened their lines, armed their weapons, and prepared for the storm. They knew they could not match the enemy ship for ship. They knew their defenses would not hold forever. But they also knew something the enemy didn't, that every minute they held would matter. Every second of resistance was another spark for the galaxy to see. The survivors who fought beside them felt it too. They were terrified, yes, but beneath the terror was a strange kind of pride. For the first time since their own worlds had fallen, they weren't running. They weren't begging for help. They were standing shoulder to shoulder with humanity, ready to face the impossible. The first wave struck without warning. The sky lit up in fire as enemy ships descended, raining destruction across the outer defenses. Metal screamed as human ships broke apart, burning into the void. Still the defenders fought. They fought with precision, with fury, with desperation. Every loss was answered with a counterstrike. Every wound became fuel for their defiance. The battle spread like wildfire. Across the colony's orbit, explosions bloomed like dying stars. Enemy vessels pressed harder, their numbers endless, their formations perfect. Humanity's lines bent under the pressure, but they did not break. Crews worked until their hands bled, patching holes, rerouting power, keeping their ships alive with nothing but stubborn will. On the ground, the survivors huddled in shelters, listening to the roar of battle above. Children pressed their hands against the walls, feeling the vibrations of each strike. Mothers and fathers whispered words of comfort they barely believed themselves. Every explosion shook their hope, but then they remembered the humans who stood above them, refusing to yield. The enemy's second wave came harder, faster, crueler. Their ships cut through defenses with brutal precision, tearing holes in the human line. Alarms blared across every deck, and captains barked orders through smoke and fire. Some ships were lost in silence, their crews swallowed by the void. Others rammed the enemy head-on, choosing to burn bright rather than fade away. Through it all, the humans fought with a kind of madness. They turned debris into weapons, traps into victories, chaos into opportunity. Where others would have fled, they pressed forward. Where others would have surrendered, they pushed harder. Every move screamed the same message: we are still here. The survivors watching from the ground began to believe what once seemed impossible. Maybe humanity could hold. Maybe they could turn the tide. Maybe this fire really was strong enough to survive the storm. But the enemy was not finished. Their third wave approached, larger than the first two combined. The horizon filled with ships, their weapons glowing like the eyes of predators in the dark. The defenders braced themselves, exhausted, bloodied, but still unbroken. The air was thick with tension. Every voice grew quiet. Every hand trembled on a weapon, a lever, a console. This was it, the moment when everything would be decided. In the command deck of the largest human vessel, silence hung heavy. The crew stared at the incoming wave, their faces pale but their eyes steady. They knew what was coming. They knew the cost. And still not one of them moved to flee. Instead, they whispered to each other, voices barely audible over the hum of failing engines. Promises. Memories. Prayers. Some thought of families far away. Some thought of the ruins they had sworn to protect. Some thought of nothing at all except the next move they would make. Above the burning colony, the two forces faced each other in silence. The humans, battered but unbroken. The enemy, endless and merciless. The stars themselves seemed to tremble, waiting for the clash that would decide everything. And then, in the stillness before the final strike, a single message whispered through the comms. For words that carried more weight than fleets, more fire than weapons. We will not fall. The enemy's ships surged forward, the darkness closing in. The humans braced themselves, every heart pounding, every breath sharp with fear and determination. The galaxy watched in silence, holding its breath. Because everyone knew, the next moment would either shatter hope forever, or ignite it into a blaze the universe could never ignore. The enemy wave surged forward like a wall of black fire, filling the horizon until there was no starlight left to see. Human ships, battered and weary, braced for the impact. They had expected this. They had prepared themselves for the moment when the darkness would finally come crashing down. But what no one expected was the silence that followed. The enemy did not strike at once. Their fleet held just outside range, a vast ocean of metal and shadow waiting. It was as if they wanted the humans to feel the weight of their presence, to taste the fear before the killing blow. Every second stretched into eternity. Crews gripped their controls, sweat sliding down their faces, hearts pounding so loud it felt as though the sound itself might give them away. Then, without warning, the enemy's formation split. Half of the fleet remained, poised against humanity's line, but the other half broke away, slipping into the void with a precision that felt too deliberate to be chance. At first, confusion rippled through the human ranks. Where were they going? What target could be more important than the colony itself? And then the realization struck, cold and merciless. They weren't just here to destroy. They were here to erase. The breakaway fleet wasn't retreating, it was hunting. Hunting for the scattered survivors, the outposts beyond this system, the hidden refuges where the abandoned clung to life. Humanity hadn't just drawn the enemy's wrath, they had drawn its full attention. Panic rippled through the defenders. The choice was unbearable: stay and fight here or scatter to protect those who could not protect themselves. Either path meant sacrifice. Either path risked everything. But the humans did not break. Their commanders spoke quickly, their voices steady even as alarms blared around them. They split their own meager forces, sending ships after the breakaway fleet, knowing they were outnumbered, knowing they would be swallowed whole if caught. They did it anyway because the alternative was unthinkable. To let the enemy consume the survivors without resistance would be worse than defeat. The survivors on the colony felt the shift even before the comms carried the news. They saw fewer ships in the sky, fewer lights holding the line. Fear spread through the shelters like fire, voices rising in panic. But then the humans who remained among them, soldiers too wounded to return to their ships, engineers with soot on their faces, stepped forward. They did not make speeches. They did not promise safety. They simply began to prepare, reinforcing shelters, passing out weapons, turning every broken corridor into a choke point. If the enemy landed here, they would not find a people waiting to die. They would find humanity standing with them, ready to fight to the last. Above, the enemy moved again. This time, they struck with a suddenness that tore the silence apart. Beams of energy cut through the dark, explosions rippled across the human line, and ships screamed into fire. The defenders answered with everything they had, their weapons carving bright scars across the void. The battle became chaos, ships colliding, fire spreading, voices cut short mid-sentence. Yet through it all, the humans held. And then came the second twist. Amid the chaos, something new appeared on the sensors. At first, it seemed like a distortion, a flicker of static among the stars. But as it drew closer, the shape grew clearer. It wasn't the enemy. It wasn't human. It was something else, something old. A massive vessel emerged from the dark, its hull cracked and scarred with age, its engines glowing faintly as if waking from centuries of sleep. The survivors who saw it gasped, their voices shaking with disbelief. The ship bore the markings of an ancient empire thought long dead, one of the first that had vanished when the enemy rose. For generations, their worlds had been nothing but ruins. Their people were gone. Yet here, against all reason, one of their warships had returned. But it was not empty. The comms crackled to life, carrying voices none had expected to hear. Survivors. Remnants of the lost empire, hidden in silence, watching from the shadows all these years. They had seen humanity's defiance. They had seen what no one else had dared. And now they were stepping back into the fight. Shock rippled through the defenders. Hope flared, raw and dangerous. But it wasn't simple salvation. The newcomers were few, their ship heavily damaged, their resources almost gone. They had not come to win the war. They had come because humanity's stand had proven something to them, that resistance was still possible. And with their arrival came a revelation. The enemy wasn't acting blindly. They weren't just destroying. They were searching. searching for something buried in the ruins of the ancient empire. Something the newcomers had hidden long ago. And now, because of humanity's defiance, the enemy was more desperate than ever to find it. The stakes had shifted again. It wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about keeping that secret, whatever it was, out of the enemy's grasp. If they found it, the war would not just consume the system. It would consume everything. The humans did not falter. Their voices carried across the comms, filled with fire, with determination. They didn't ask what the secret was. They didn't demand answers. They simply swore to protect it, to hold the line no matter the cost. The enemy, sensing the shift, pressed harder. Their fleets surged, weapons lighting up the void, striking with a fury that shook even the strongest hearts. Human ships fell one after another, their wreckage scattering like broken stars. The colony trembled under the bombardment, shelters shaking, walls cracking. The survivors clung to each other, waiting for the moment the enemy would break through. In the command decks, every choice grew heavier. Every decision carried lives with it. Do they hold the line or fall back to protect the ancient survivors? Do they focus on the colony or chase the fleet hunting beyond the system? Each answer felt like a death sentence, yet humanity pressed on, driven by the same fire that had carried them this far. The enemy drew closer, surrounding them, suffocating them. But in the heart of the chaos, amid the screams and the fire and the endless shadow, one truth remained unshaken. Humanity would not back down. The galaxy watched, breathless, as the storm reached its peak. The enemy bore down. The secret of the ancient empire hung in the balance, and the defenders stood with everything they had left. Because the next moment, the clash of fleets, the shattering of silence, would decide not just the battle but the fate of hope itself. The battle erupted with a fury that shook the stars themselves. The enemy surged forward, their fleets darkening the sky, their weapons carving lines of fire through the void. Humanity's ships met them head-on, engines burning past their limits, shields flickering with each brutal strike. The void became a storm of light and shadow, every explosion a reminder of what was at stake. On the ground, the colony trembled. Dust and ash fell from broken ceilings, children clung to their parents, and the wounded cried out as the bombardment rattled the shelters. The survivors knew the humans above were outnumbered, that every ship lost meant the sky grew darker. Yet when they looked up through the cracks in the ruins, they still saw human fire burning in the heavens. That fire gave them courage, even as fear pressed into their chests like iron. In orbit, commanders shouted orders through the chaos, their voices rough with smoke and exhaustion. Ships split from formation, charging enemy lines at impossible angles, tearing through larger vessels with reckless abandon. Every loss bought another heartbeat for the colony, another chance for hope to live. Humanity fought as though each second mattered, and it did. The ancient vessel that had returned from the shadows loomed at the edge of battle, its hull fractured but its weapons still glowing faintly. The survivors aboard it revealed the truth in hurried fragments over the comms. Long ago, when their empire had still thrived, they had discovered something in the void, something the enemy had hunted for across countless systems. They had hidden it, sealing it deep within the stars, knowing the enemy would never stop searching. That secret was why the darkness had spread, why entire civilizations had fallen. The enemy wanted it back. But they had miscalculated. They had not counted on humanity. The humans listened in silence, their faces hard, their hands steady on the controls of failing ships. They didn't need to know exactly what the secret was. It didn't matter. What mattered was that if the enemy claimed it, the galaxy would be lost. Humanity made their choice as they always had, with defiance. They would protect it even if it meant their own extinction. The enemy must have sensed it because they struck harder than ever. Their main fleet surged against the human line, forcing them back, breaking through defenses one after another. Ships were torn apart in fire, escape pods scattering like embers across the void. Still the humans fought. They rammed their vessels into the enemy, detonating reactors in blinding bursts of light. They turned wreckage into weapons, chaos into strategy. The ancient warship moved at last, dragging its broken hull into the heart of the battle. Its cannons roared, cutting swaths through the enemy formation. For the first time the tide wavered. The survivors aboard shouted their defiance, voices trembling with long-buried pride. Humanity rallied to them, their ships surging forward, pushing back with everything they had left. But then the enemy revealed their true hand. From the darkness emerged a vessel larger than anything seen before. It blotted out the stars, its hull a jagged shadow that seemed to drink in the light around it. This was no ordinary warship. It was their command, the predator at the heart of the swarm. Its weapons glowed with impossible energy, and with a single strike it shattered the ancient vessel's shields, tearing holes through its armor. The survivors aboard screamed through the comms, voices cut with static as fire tore through their ship. Humanity's leaders knew the truth in that moment. If the command vessel wasn't stopped, nothing else mattered. The colony, the survivors, even hope itself, it would all burn. Every remaining ship turned toward it. Engines flared, weapons blazed, and humanity threw itself at the monster in the dark. They carved at its hull, tearing chunks of metal free, but the enemy vessel was too vast, too strong. It swatted ships aside like insects, its weapons shredding entire formations in seconds. On the ground, the survivors felt the sky shake. They saw streaks of fire raining down, heard the thunder of impacts echoing through the ruins. They knew the humans were dying above them, knew the line was breaking. Tears filled their eyes as they whispered prayers, holding one another close. Yet even in their fear they felt something else, pride. Because the humans had not abandoned them. They were fighting to the last breath, and that mattered more than anything. Then came the choice. The ancient vessel, burning and broken, still had power left in its heart. Its survivors spoke through the comms one final time. They would not let their secret fall. They would give humanity a chance. With failing engines and ruptured decks, the massive warship turned itself toward the enemy command vessel. Every human ship cleared a path, pouring fire into the enemy's defenses, holding nothing back. The ancient vessel surged forward, flames trailing behind it, voices of its crew echoing across every channel. And then, in a blaze brighter than a sun, it rammed the enemy command vessel head-on. The explosion shook the heavens, tearing through the monster's hull, ripping its weapons apart. For a heartbeat, silence followed, the void lit only by drifting fire. The enemy reeled. Their fleet faltered. For the first time they hesitated. Humanity struck with everything they had left. Ship after ship dived into the chaos, firing until their weapons burned out, detonating reactors in desperate charges. The enemy broke apart, scattered by the storm of defiance. Some fled into the void, others were torn apart in the fire. The battle was won, but at a terrible cost. The humans who survived barely had ships to return to. Their fleets were shattered, their crews thinned to a fraction of what they had been. The colony still stood, but its skies were filled with smoke and debris, its ground scarred with ash. The survivors wept with relief and grief, holding on to one another as they realized they were still alive. But the twist came in the silence after victory. Among the wreckage of the ancient vessel, deep in the debris field, signals pulsed faintly. Humanity's ships picked them up, strange coded patterns not like anything they had heard before. At first, they thought it was the dying echo of the survivors' last transmission. But the more they listened, the clearer it became. It wasn't a goodbye. It was a warning. The secret the enemy had hunted wasn't destroyed in the explosion. It had been hidden deeper still, carried away at the last moment, sealed within the wreckage of smaller escape craft that had vanished into the void. The enemy had been stopped here, but they would not stop searching. Humanity stood victorious but not safe. The war was not over. It had only just begun. The survivors of the colony gathered together, looking to the sky where humanity's ships still glowed like embers in the dark. They knew the cost had been unbearable. They knew the enemy would return stronger, hungrier, more determined than ever. Yet they also knew something else. They knew the universe would never again call them abandoned. Because humanity had stood when no one else would. Humanity had fought until the darkness bled. Humanity had refused to back down. And as the wreckage drifted in silence, a new fire was born in the hearts of the galaxy. A fire that would not be easily extinguished. The smoke still hung in the air long after the battle was over. In the silence that followed, it was almost impossible to believe the chaos had ended. Fragments of ships drifted in the void, glowing embers against the endless dark, while the survivors looked out through cracked windows and shattered hulls. What had once been fleets now looked like graveyards. And yet, despite the ruin, there was a strange stillness that carried with it something fragile and powerful: hope. The colony that had once trembled beneath bombardment was still standing. Its buildings were scarred, many of its towers reduced to broken frames of steel and stone, but beneath the dust, life stirred. Families came out of the shelters, blinking at the daylight they had thought they would never see again. Some cried, some simply fell to their knees, hands pressed against the soil, as though touching the ground was proof they were still alive. In their hearts, they knew the truth. They had been saved because humanity refused to abandon them. For the human soldiers, the cost was written into every scarred face, every empty seat on their ships, every name that would never be answered again. They had won, but it had not been without loss. The silence of comms channels where friends once shouted, the sight of drifting wreckage carrying the echoes of laughter that would never return, all of it weighed heavy on their shoulders. Still, no one called it meaningless. Each sacrifice was part of the greater whole, each loss a thread in the fabric of victory. Humanity had given more than anyone thought possible, and in return, they had carved a future where none had existed. The survivors of the ancient vessel, those whose voices had been heard only in the final moments, were mourned too. They had chosen to burn their ship and themselves to destroy the enemy command vessel, and their bravery became part of the story that spread through the galaxy. They had carried the secret, and when the universe turned away, they had trusted humanity to carry it further. That trust had not been misplaced. Humanity had not let them down. But the warning they left behind lingered. The coded signal pulsing faintly in the debris was studied in hushed chambers, its meaning pieced together by minds that refused to rest. It confirmed what many already suspected. The enemy's hunger was not for conquest alone. They were hunting something deeper, something older, something hidden in the bones of the galaxy itself. The secret had not been destroyed with the ship. It had been carried off, scattered, hidden again. Humanity had only won a reprieve, not an ending. Still, the reprieve mattered. It was time enough for the colony to breathe again, for children to laugh in the streets, for families to rebuild homes from rubble and turn fear into memory. It was time enough for the galaxy to take notice. For so long, system after system had turned its back on them. Neighboring worlds had looked away, unwilling to risk their own safety. But when news spread of what humanity had done, when stories carried the fire of their defiance, the silence of the galaxy cracked. Voices rose, some in awe, some in shame. Entire civilizations realized they could no longer pretend the fight wasn't theirs. Humanity's refusal to bend had forced everyone else to see their own reflection. On the ground in the colony's broken capital, a gathering was held. Survivors stood shoulder to shoulder with human soldiers, speaking not as strangers but as kin. Words of gratitude spilled into the open air, heavy with emotion, voices trembling with grief and joy at once. For the first time in memory they felt they were not alone. Humanity had stood in the gap when no one else would, and that act changed everything. The human commander who had led the defense stood before them, his armor still scorched, his voice rough from endless hours of battle. He didn't give a speech of glory or triumph. He spoke simply, honestly as one human speaking to another. He told them that humanity had not come for recognition or reward. They had come because it was right. Because no one deserved to be abandoned. Because even in the darkest void, there must be someone willing to carry the light. Tears filled the eyes of many who listened. Some held on to those words as though they were lifelines, promises carved into the marrow of history. The survivors vowed that they, too, would stand when others turned away, that they would never forget the fire humanity brought into their night. In the days that followed, messages arrived from across the stars. Other worlds, once silent, now offered aid. Fleets too late to join the battle pledged themselves to rebuilding. Supplies were sent, medical teams deployed, architects and engineers volunteering their skill. It was not forgiveness for their abandonment, it could never erase that, but it was a beginning. Humanity's act had forced them all to remember what it meant to fight not just for themselves, but for each other. Yet humanity did not rest. They knew what others were slow to admit, that the enemy would return. The wreckage of their shattered fleet was proof of their strength, but also of their limits. Even broken, the enemy had nearly succeeded. And somewhere out there, the secret still pulsed, still waiting to be found again. Humanity prepared, rebuilding their ships, strengthening their colonies, forging alliances not out of fear but out of determination. They would not be caught unready again. For the survivors of the colony, life slowly reshaped itself. Children played where ruins once stood, laughter echoing through streets rebuilt with human hands alongside their own. Fields were planted not just to grow food but to grow hope. Each sunrise became a reminder that they had not been erased, that their story had not ended in silence. They spoke often of the night when the stars burned with fire and humanity came. They told their children so the memory would never fade. The enemy had wanted despair. Instead they had forged unity. The unexpected twist, that the secret was not gone, remained like a shadow at the edge of every thought. But instead of crushing spirits, it became a call to strength. Humanity did not hide from it, and neither did the colony. They chose to see it as proof that their fight had meaning. If the enemy feared what was hidden so much that they would wage endless war to reclaim it, then protecting it mattered more than anything. One evening, long after the fires had cooled and the stars shone quietly again, survivors and humans alike gathered at the highest hill overlooking the rebuilt capital. Together they lit a flame, a single towering beacon that pierced the night sky. It wasn't a weapon and it wasn't a signal of war. It was a promise. A promise that no matter how dark the void became, no matter how many enemies came to break them, humanity and those they protected would stand together. For some, it was the first time they felt truly safe. For others, it was the first time they allowed themselves to feel grief. And for everyone there, it was a moment carved into memory, a reminder that even in a universe that had turned away, they were not alone anymore. When the last ember of the ceremony died down, silence settled again. The stars glimmered above, endless and unknowable, carrying both danger and wonder. The people below looked at them not with fear but with determination. The war was not over. The enemy would return. The secret still called from the void. But they had something far stronger than any weapon or hidden truth. They had each other. Humanity had shown the galaxy what resilience truly meant. They had taught that being human was not about strength of arms alone, but about the strength to choose, to fight when it mattered most, to refuse to abandon those who needed them, to carry the fire no matter how dark the night became. That was the lesson left behind in every broken ship, every scarred street, every tear shed for the fallen. And so, as the colony healed and humanity rebuilt, a message spread quietly across the stars. It was whispered in marketplaces, shouted in gathering halls, etched into stone and carried on the winds of rumor. A simple truth, one that no force in the universe could erase. The universe may turn away, but humanity will not. And in that truth, a future was born. One written not by fear but by defiance. One carried not by the strong alone but by the willing. A future where the galaxy would remember for as long as stars burned, that humanity had refused to back down, and in doing so had kept the fire alive for everyone. Thank you for joining me on this journey. Humanity's resilience, our refusal to back down, is what makes these stories unforgettable. If this tale spoke to you, stay tuned, because there are more HFY stories to come, each carrying that same fire of defiance and hope. Until next time, remember, even when the universe turns away, humanity never will.